Hello, everyone. I hope you are grooving to the fabulous content and those beats on this fine Wednesday or Thursday, depending on your hemisphere. Welcome to this fabulous panel about remote work and the future of work as we know it. We've got some fabulous brains beside me here. We've got products, we've got remote work experts. My name is Savannah Peterson. I'm your very fortunate host and moderator. To open things up, we're going to answer the question posed by the title of this panel. Is it home sweet home? And let's go to you to open this up.
Sure, so happy to be here, Savannah, and thanks for kicking it over to me. And folks, so nice to meet you. I am Solmssen, the co-founder and CTO of Athena, where we build a harassment prevention training platform designed with remote first teams in mind. As for the question, is it home sweet home? I think it really depends who you're asking. And it's also important to note that pandemic remote work is not representative of what remote work has been for a long time or how we should think of it. But to answer the question for the world we're in today and pandemic remote work, there are a lot of discrepancies in folks' work from home experiences based on who they are. Work from home has been especially challenging for single parents, for caregivers. Statistically, it's more challenging for moms and dads. So it's hard to give a universally applicable answer.
Excellent. And Andreas, why don't you let us know your thoughts on home sweet home?
Yeah, sure. Hey, everybody. Andreas. I'm an investor in about a bit more than 2,000 tools for remote work. My personal take on this is what we experience right now is still like this emergency work from home setup. Like we got better in doing it. We have now experience and everything, but working from home while your kids are screaming around you, that's not the setup that most remote workers usually have. Never meeting friends is not the setup that most remote workers usually have. Not going to the gym, all this kind of stuff. That's not the right setup. No, this is more like this whole emergency work from home setup. So if there's like one big takeaway from this panel is like, let's try to separate COVID from typical remote work.
I think we can all agree that this is a unique working experience, and those of us who have been on this side of remote work for a long time are also experiencing some unexpected challenges. Sara, hello, welcome. Thank you for being here with us today.
Hi, thanks for having me. I am the founder and CEO of FlexJobs, as well as Remote.co, and have been in the remote space for a little over 13 years. We're an entirely remote company, and while we could be considered pros at remote work in many cases, it's, I second and third what others have been saying, that this is not normal. Even for remote work, this is definitely harder. Certainly I'm actually a parent, so the school situation and having kids at home is one big part of it, but it's also just the psychological toll, and let alone economic or medical in many cases, of what's going on in the world and globally. And I think that from a mental health and wellness standpoint, this is also, even if people were in offices, they'd be struggling a lot more with everything happening in the world, and the layer of stress and anxiety and increase in depression and things of that nature. And so I would say that remote work is also being held accountable, or is experiencing this, and in some cases being unfairly judged as a lack of productivity or things like that, that it's really a little bit more about what's going on in the world.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, and I know that's going to be a running theme in some of the solutions and discussion that we have today. But the mental health situation that's going on, there was always an isolation factor to working remote, and we had found ways to connect with our communities around the world that fixed that. But right now, a lot of us are still in a pretty hardcore shelter in place. I'm here in San Francisco. We're quite locked down still, and it's hard. That community connection is hard, and I know that you all have a lot of resources and tools for everyone to help them with. Clay, good morning, good afternoon. How are you?
Great, thanks for having me. I'm Clay Kellogg, the CEO for Terminal. We help growing technology companies build remote teams. In many cases, we're actually helping most companies go on their remote journey to become remote first. And so to the question of, I guess in I guess boring panel fashion, I'm in violent agreement that this is not the normal sort of transition. Most companies obviously had not planned to go to the extent of remote that we are right now. In fact, we did a survey in August where we surveyed 400 leading technology and HR leaders and asked them how many had remote plans for 2020. 19% had planned for, had truly planned for a remote transition during the year. So clearly this is kind of unprecedented times, as the cliche goes. I do think though that, you know, on the positive, remote is now the center of conversation for all leadership teams. And we certainly saw prior to COVID-19 that remote was usually led, aside from companies that were fully distributed, remote was usually led by one employee who either went rogue or, you know, just kind of got fed up with the lack of support they were getting and the lack of ability for them to do their job. Now, every company leadership team is sitting around the table talking about their remote strategy. And so while this is not normal remote, and we will get to what a normal remote looks like at some point in the future, the level of attention and effort that's going into actually developing a remote strategy, and really what we would call that as your talent strategy, is at an all-time high, which is great to see.
I like that you just ended that on a positive note. Also, can violent agreement be the only violence we have from now on, where you're just like juiced to be on board with something? I sincerely appreciated it. And it's nice, you know, I think actually, while there's a few different opinions and perspectives on this panel, the fact that we all agree on this is madness is a really important baseline, because for folks still struggling with where we're at, just establishing that level of vulnerability and transparency is core. Darren, Murph, don't think I forgot you, Captain Remote Work over there. How's life in North Carolina?
It's good. No tropical storms today, Savannah, so that's always a plus. I'm Darren. I'm the head of remote at GitLab. So we make a complete DevOps solution delivered as a single application. We are also an incredibly large all-remote company, over 1,300 people in more than 65 countries. And we have not had a company-owned office ever. So we have been doing this remote thing for a really long time. I've spent my entire career across the spectrum of remote. So it's very interesting to see tens of millions of people suddenly hone in on something that has been a relatively niche way to work over the years. So to the question of, is this home sweet home? Yes and no. So I feel like I haven't really worked remotely at all for the past 7 months. I've simply been forced to work from home, which is very different. I'm used to traveling a lot. If this virtual background weren't here, you could actually see a model Delta jet behind me. So I miss my planes, I miss flying, I miss all of that. But on the yes part, this has been a forcing function for opening up a more inclusive and flexible work environment. It has proven that many jobs can in fact be done remotely. And a lot of leaders that were staunchly against it simply because they were steeped in tradition or didn't want to try anything different have been forced to do that. And I do think it will create a sweeter work environment going forward. At the very least, it will allow more people to boldly walk into a job interview and ask, what's your workplace stance on flexibility? And that's a big win. So if we get that on the other side of this, it's something that we can appreciate for sure.
Absolutely. I like that you're adding that sweetness. I think a lot of people have opened their eyes to both the pros and the cons, as well as the challenges. Working from home didn't just make it easy, and it's not just like some, you know, cakewalk to wear your jammies every day and not have to do your hair. It's a whole different thing. Not that I do my hair and wear sequins every day at home, but I mean, why not? YOLO. Okay, nothing wrong with that. So we talked a lot in your openings, and thank you all for that. That was outstanding, about this remote work and that we were proud of. And for those of us that are either aspiring to do that now or adjusting to remote, how do we get there? How do we get from point A, or well, whatever point number we're at right now, to a remote work future that is supportive of all sorts of employees? And I'm gonna turn it to you, Clay, because you hit on the tools right away just a second ago.
Yeah, I think that in many regards, the infrastructure is set for companies to be remote and to be successful. And really the next phase is less of us, uncovering a new tool or a new framework, and really just leadership teams coming together to fully embrace remote and understand that what they need to provide for their remote employees is different but equal to their headquartered employees. And so, to get to where we're all proud of our remote teams, I really think it's, first and foremost, creating an infrastructure that allows us to become great remote employers, creating the programs so that we can attract the best talent, and then start to remove the lens of remote versus HQ and just talk about this is our entire team. It doesn't matter where they are. It doesn't matter if they're going to an office or they're working from home or they're doing flex. Really, it's how do we support them and make sure that they're getting everything as an employee that we want to provide so that they can have a remote career as opposed to a remote job. And we can do a good job of ensuring that everyone has an opportunity for success.
I love that. What a nice reframe too, a remote career versus a remote job. And I think for a lot of us run our own businesses or have in the past or have a very kind of autonomous function. But I think that was because of our desire to have a remote career. And now it's becoming the systemic thing. And I think that's a really awesome point. And I know you've got some great insight here.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about this one. So first, I'd like to say I really do think the single best thing we can do to get remote work back to a remote work that we're all proud of is get the pandemic under control. Shouldn't need to be said, but that's number one. And then next, I'd really love to just jump off of what Clay said about tools. So since at Athena, we build a product that's designed for remote first teams, we spend a lot of time talking to customers about what that means and what a tool that's really built with remote folks in mind has. So in our case, as a harassment prevention training platform, one of the alternative tools that can be used in a virtual world is putting a lawyer on Zoom. And a lot of the time when that happens, that's sort of not an experience that was designed to be on Zoom, and B, the lawyer that's on the Zoom isn't necessarily addressing what harassment looks like in a work from home scenario, not talking about Slack or Zoom or inclusion in virtual meetings, the things that we think are really important when you're working with remote first teams. So I just sort of want to +1 we need to be providing tools and support structures for our teams that are designed for remote first workers and not just shoddy transitions of something that worked for a traditional model into the online world.
Absolutely, I love that. Any chance the lawyers are cheaper because they're remote? No, I'm just kidding, probably not.
I wouldn't guess.
Yeah, unfortunately, I haven't found it works that way with counsel ever, but I think that's a really good point. Darren, you've been doing this even longer than I have, which is really saying something. What's missing?
I would say taking the approach of this being a journey is probably missing. A lot of people are trying to do this as a binary switch, flip a switch, you're remote overnight, everything should just work. Instead of embracing the reality that this will be a journey. If you have a goal to get 20% better in sales, you probably set an annual goal and then quarterly milestones to get there. And honestly, for most companies, you should consider the remote transition in a very similar way. Maybe Q1 is taking a tools audit, figuring out what tools you have, maybe figuring out if any of them can be used in a more remote first practice. If you use Google Docs, for example, start attaching those as agendas to every meeting, and now suddenly all of your meetings are more inclusive and more documented. So you didn't need a new tool, you just needed to use it in a new way. But then there may be some tools that you do need to add to build reports, to make sure that EQ is being monitored, to make sure that people have a single place to work. At GitLab, we use GitLab, the product, to do all of our project collaboration, and we would struggle without that as the heartbeat of where all work happens. And then you need to figure out what other gaps need to be filled. Are there communication breakdowns? Are there talent breakdowns? What kind of talent do you need to hire to start doing this? This cannot be a line item in a job description. If you just tack this on, the chief people officer, chief operations officer, remote is far too nuanced for it to just be an afterthought of someone's job, hence the head of remote. I do think you will see a lot more companies leaning that way, or at the very least assembling remote leadership councils where executives spend a dedicated amount of their time getting this right.
Definitely, you've got a lot of assets in the GitLab guidebook. I feel like it's my handbook right now. I feel like it's like my my diary toolkit. But in terms of that documentation, we've been talking about it the whole pandemic, but I can't get over that enough. The sooner you start making it easier for people to access the resources they need all the time, the less of a headache this whole thing will be. Sara, you have some insight here, I know, as well.
Well, and to carry on what Darren was saying a little bit with the journey, I think that one of the things we have to remember is that so many millions of organizations were forced to try on this remote thing under duress, and that both management and the worker, the people doing it didn't necessarily want it. And so now we're looking at it as, okay, what's the long term? And I was just talking to my team earlier today, and we're saying on one hand for remote work, it's been game day trying to figure this out, but yet we're also in a marathon with no end. And so how do we look at this? And I would implore and encourage people to look at culture. Culture is something that obviously happens no matter what. Many organizations have worked really hard on their in-office culture, but really culture is much more about a place. And starting to conscientiously think about how you can translate and integrate remote into your culture. And that can be things, as fun as, trivia night or kind of fun things that you like to think of that you do in the office. Well, how does that correlate? In the States, we have Halloween coming up. Well, every Halloween, one of the things we have historically done is we think about, it's fun to go over to people's desks and grab candy. Like that was just kind of a fun thing in the office that I kind of missed when I started FlexJobs. And so when we on-ramp people, we actually think about certain questions to plant seeds around getting to know them and engaging them in these kinds of activities. So we actually send out care packages of Halloween candy before Halloween with some little fun notes, and we pick them according to like common favorites and things. And those are, people love getting it in the mail. Those little gestures, those little thoughts of how you can transition in-office work to remote go a long way, and your team feels the appreciation and the thought behind it. So I just encourage people to really look at culture at this point in the journey.
I just want to give you some snaps for that. The little GIFs, it really matters. Shameless plug. If you go to savannahpeterson.com, you can see my remote work gift guide. Little tiny inexpensive things can really brighten someone's day. And it's the thoughtfulness, even sending cards. I have a lot more pen pals right now than I had before this. And it's so much more than a Slack message if you take the time to actually write a note and really let your team know that you're thinking of them. So we started flirting with a tools question, and I know that we have a lot of tools ideas on this panel. So Andreas, what new tools are here to stay? What is it, a Zoom revolution? What's going on? Break it down for us.
So first up, I'm a very active investor in this space, and a lot of the tools I'm going to mention I actively invested in. So like grain of salt and everything.
Disclaimer, yeah.
I'm investing because I'm a big fan, so like there's a good thing. So one thing I'm hoping for is that we can use this opportunity to also hire more cross-regional, not only like in this one city the office is in, but like in the other, like in the rest of America, maybe rest of Americas, like maybe Latin America, maybe even like all over the world. And there's like a lot of aspects that create complexity here. And one of the biggest one is payroll and compliance. And there's multiple tools here. And like the most famous one right now is remote.com, which I can highly recommend. Global payroll, global compliance, and global like benefits and like a few other things in this area. Another thing is like if you have more people working from different places in the world, providing them with office equipment in a professional manner is actually really hard. And there's a company called firstbasehq.com, which is doing this really, really well. So you can basically define what kind of office setup you want worldwide, and they make sure your team gets this. And one more company I would like to mention is if you work internationally, you will really quickly notice that people have different cultural backgrounds. They just come from different parts of the world. They have different upbringing. They have different cultural norms around a lot of different topics. And there's a company called Crescendo, crescendowork.com, which focuses around the topic which is called cultural competence. So the idea is that you have, for example, an Indian engineering team and a marketing team in California and several clients in Japan. And you struggle to understand why like everybody kind of offends everybody else constantly, you know, because of just like little different cultural norms. And Crescendo is basically helping teams to figure out how to do this well. And there's like a ton of other tools. Like I'm pretty sure everybody's like tired from Zoom already, you know, but like there's so much interesting stuff happening right now. There's companies trying to measure how happy you look while you're in a Zoom call. There's companies that are, yeah, exactly. There's companies that train you your English while you're in Zoom calls and so on and so on. So actually I'm hoping that Zoom becomes a super interesting platform for like a lot of more innovation to come.
Yeah, this is, I think, the first real product iteration of what can potentially come in this space. And as some of you may or may not be aware, we only had about 35% of the workforce working in this capacity before. Lots of stats now suggesting around 30% in terms of a permanent structure. And given the given the real estate situation and everything else right now, which we'll talk about in just a second, there's a lot of opportunity for new tools and innovation here. So if you have a great idea or you're a startup in that space, talk to this guy over here, and maybe you can get some investment. Still learning how the Hollywood Squares works. All right, now moving down to Darren. I know you have some tools for us. I've used them myself. Tell it to the people.
Yeah, of course, I can't help but plug GitLab. We use GitLab to collaborate across our teams. It's made by a remote team, so it works really well for remote teams. So there's that. More granularly, I would say check out Psych Insights, SIKE Insights. It's essentially the EQ platform for your team. A lot of companies are trying to figure out how to build culture, how to build rapport, and to simply monitor whether or not employees feel like they belong or they're connected or how they're doing. They're doing an amazing job at plugging that into existing Slack instances and giving managers some incredible insights. You need to build a handbook. You have to have a single source of truth of documentation. You can use GitLab to do that, but a simpler alternative is Almanac, almanac.io. They have templates already from the best open source knowledge in the world, GitLab included, so you don't have to start from scratch. And crucially, they support version control, which is like accept and reject in a Word doc, but with far more control, so your entire team can contribute. And lastly, I'll touch a bit on real estate. Codi, C-O-D-I, is a communal neighborhood workspace company that is empowering people to essentially convert their homes into workspaces. So if you don't want to go back to the office, but you're also tired of working from home, you can just find a Codi in your own neighborhood and connect with people that either you work with or people that work in companies near you. Find a safe space to work that isn't your home, but also isn't the office. I think it's an amazing time for them. They're expanding across the country and the world. And so for leaders that are trying to figure out, is it always going to be work from home? Is it always going to be the office? Consider the third space. At GitLab, we allow people to submit reimbursements for those third spaces. And so once travel restrictions are lifted, it allows your team to have a more inclusive way to think about where their most productive workspace would be.
Sara, I know you've got a sneaky surprise tool to close this question out.
Well, one of the things that we've done over the years is work with a lot of organizations who are not remote and how they're integrating and trying to figure it out. And there's a lot of ways to do that. Like one of the ones that people tend to not expect is there are platforms that help you have like almost like an architect schema of an office. So you can see where people are and you can see, oh, Sarah's in her office, Anne's in hers, Savvy's in her, oh, Clay and Darren are conferencing and meeting. And we use one called Sococo. There are others as well. And they integrate with Slack and other platforms, but it's a really nice visual cue, especially for people who are more accustomed to visual cues and trying to translate being in an office to being remote. So that's one. And then the last little bit I'd say is video. I know everyone, it's the new tool, but it's actually, as a remote organization, we hardly use video. I know many remote organizations are different, but I do want to emphasize for a lot of people who are over Zoomed, of which is pretty much everyone I'm hearing, I've actually had more Zoom calls in the last 6 months than I have in 13 years. Hands down, by far. So it's something that you don't always have to use the most tangible tool. I think that comfort of seeing people is really interesting, but it's also quite pressuring. And some of the benefits of working from home are actually not being on video. So just to toss that out as a final thought.
I love that. Don't be afraid to lead the pack on that. Like it doesn't matter if a Zoom call comes in with video. I have no problem just turning off my video. And often you see everybody else do that. So like little baby hack, if you're feeling stressed, you're not feeling clean, just bye. Just just do it. It's okay. Or share your screen and put a picture of your cat on it or something. Like there's other ways to get around with that. Just before we transition, and one final note, I will ask all of you to share these perhaps on your favorite social media platform. We listed a lot of resources here. So maybe we can do like a tweet thread. I'll start it and tag y'all, and then you can drop in a bunch of links for everyone. We will use the ASU GSV Summit hashtag. I'm at @SavIsSavvy. We'll make sure and do that after the panel. Andreas, one question from the audience, real quick to you before we transition. What was the last tool that you mentioned on helping with cultural norms? Sounded very cool.
Well, Crescendo, CRESCENDO, work.com. And yeah, it's like their primary use case is you have international teams that kind of misunderstand each other or offend each other sometimes. It's also really good for diversity and inclusion. For example, being able to hire authentically from minority groups and like enable them in an authentic way is like one of their prime things they do.
Awesome. Wow. So many great. I find myself taking notes while y'all are talking, which may or may not be what the moderator is supposed to do, but this happens to me all the time when I work with these smart people. Anyway, thank you for that. Something that came up when we were meeting as a panel as one of our questions, and this is actually kind of one of the more interesting questions for me because I'm extremely bullish on this. But we've talked a lot about, you know, where we are today. Looking forward, is this the future of work? Is this the digital evolution of work? Where are we going? And just to provide some context, I thought there were some interesting WSJ stats that came out today. There's only 10% real estate reoccupation commercially back in Manhattan. There's only 25% reoccupation nationwide. Places like Dallas, 40%, Los Angeles, 32%. We're not back at work. So, and in the normal way. And I know that this is absolutely no surprise to those of us as well, but it's not just because of I think the lockdowns and the sheltering. Some other interesting data that I got from Indeed this morning is that job postings are down 25% in large metro areas and only 7% in small metro areas. So if we're looking at the distribution of jobs, it's not just the purging of the people in the real estate from some of these larger metropoli. It's whether it's the requirement of the job, maybe these jobs have no location listing with them associated, that could potentially be something here. But I did think it's interesting being Techlandia. The largest declines in job postings were in Honolulu, San Francisco, Seattle, San Jose, New York, DC, and Denver. So basically every technology hotspot. So a little bit of food for thought. I want to turn this one to Darren first, since you've been a venerable mind in the space. Is this the revolution we've been waiting for?
I think so. I'm a long-term optimist in this. I realize that it's pretty tough to see it right now. I like to say that life beautifies beginning and ends, but the middles are not very memorable, though they're where character is built. So this is the opportunity for the world to build remote infrastructure and build remote fluency, build for what being on the other side of this will be. Look, a lot of companies knew that a more flexible distributed workforce was in their future, but none of them wanted to be first to press a massive pause button to try this, beta test this in their own company for fear of it wrecking their quarterlies, whatever that may be. So I do think this is a massive opportunity to do that. And I do think it will allow people who have been ostracized from the workplace, working parents, caregivers, those that have just chosen smaller communities because they mean more to them. A lot of these people have opted out of the workplace because it's essentially like the workplace doesn't want them anymore. Now, if companies are willing to source and recruit from those areas, they have access to talent that is not only incredible talent, but very loyal talent. Because although remote is growing, it still will be fairly special and an incredible perk, especially if the company not only allows remote, but actually supports remote. So I'm a long-term optimist. I do think this was, it's a tragedy that we're dealing with, obviously, but I do think there will be a lot of positives to come from this for companies that lean into it.
I like that. Clay, I know you've got something to add here.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Darren. In many cases, in many ways, I think this is really kind of COVID-19 was the unfortunate catalyst for remote and really ripped the Band-Aid off. A lot of companies grew up in the mindset of, kind of emulating the companies that they aspired to be, right? And for the previous generation, that was Google, Facebook, Twitter. All these companies were still HQ centric. But what we've seen in our stats is that in our survey, over 90% of the leaders felt really good about the sudden shift that they were able to do to work from home with COVID-19, and over 81% are more confident than they went into going into COVID-19 with their ability to thrive as a remote employer. So I feel like the first step is getting everyone to understand it can work. The second step is then to really lean in, and we're beginning to see that. And across the board, I think that, each time we see a GitLab or we see another sort of company that is beginning to show that you can build a large company and successful large company as a distributed company or as a remote first company, the next generation is never going to grow up thinking, oh, I have to be HQ centric. We joke about, if you're in San Francisco now and you go look for venture capital, look for investment and say, I'm going to use this money to build a team in downtown San Francisco, you get laughed out of the room. That's very different than even 3 years ago, right? So the next generation is going to grow up remote first, and we're going to see really this kind of just overtake what we deem as kind of normal going forward.
I like it. Another strong bullish opinion. Sara, you're building around this. Talk about it.
I absolutely think it's an inflection point and a really exciting time in remote. We've been advocating for a long time and working with large organizations from Fortune 500s down to startups over the past decade and how they're integrating remote work and advancing it internally. I actually take a more balanced approach, I guess I would imagine, from the future. The mass majority of jobs, even after this, I believe are going to remain hybrid, meaning some in person and some remote. It's been probably upwards of 95% with that right now. We're having, especially those with geographical location requirements, whether that's city, state, region, country. And that can be for tax purposes and other reasons, but in general, I think the comfort level is obviously going to be there in a way that has never been. I think it's just advanced the remote work methodology and ability to know that remote work can work in a lot more jobs, and at least in parts of jobs that otherwise you think can't be remote at all, in a way that's probably shaved 20 years off the timeline. So I think it's very exciting. I do caution people to think that I don't believe that companies are going to be primarily remote in the future. Meaning exclusively 100% distributed. I think that's likely to be still not the majority for the next couple of decades, honestly. I don't think I think the goal here with remote work, at least my goal and many of the organizations we talk to, is to harness the best of the options we have. And for many people, working in person actually does bring out better in them. And for other people, working remotely is better for them. So I think what you really want to be focusing on is harnessing the best of technology and remote, and then also harnessing the best of what people and in person can bring. For those of us who say we're remote, 100% distributed, it's actually not true. Most of us have retreats in person with team members. So I caution us to expect the pendulum to swing too far to the right or to the left, whichever side, too fast. Also because it's quite intimidating for a lot of companies who have relied on being in person. This is a big shift and it's still scary. And trust has always been the biggest challenge with remote and companies adopting it. So I think it's important to let people go at their own speed and as much as we can once the pandemic's over, and integrate it and really look for the wins. And emergency preparedness will be one of those moving forward.
I think that's fantastic. And Anne, I'm going to circle back to you on this question in just a second, but we have an audience question that's really on exactly what you just brought up. And as Darren knows, I'm a big fan of the trust model and all of this. I think we just need to trust our people to do their best work, and a lot of this would just be a lot better. But question from our audience, and if you are listening, again, thank you so much. Now is the time to send in those questions, so you have a chance to throw them to the panel. And thank you to those who have already. All right, panelists, how do you view the importance of employee personal data privacy protection, particularly in the home? in comparison to the strategic remote management of workers, which can often be invasive from an organizational perspective. Who wants, raise your hand if you want to answer that first. Oh man, nobody wants to talk about security.
Yeah, I'm happy to give a quick response. I think you have to stay in line a little bit again with your culture and we don't have to rethink the wheel. I think each company is going to have to look at it as what's right for them. I mean, there are different organizations with different security parameters and data that's being held by their employees at their homes. And so I think that you're going to have to look at what's right for your organization and make some very conscientious thoughts about what is right for your company, but also what's right for your employees. And you could ask questions, ask what the comfort levels are. Honestly, a lot of parents are going through this with schools for the similar reason. A lot of the technology they're trying to install on children's hardware is quite invasive. So this conversation of privacy is going to be taking place in a broad way. And I think we have to caution ourselves to have too firm of an answer, also because the law is not going to catch up with it for a while.
I think you're touching on something really important. Oh, sorry, y'all can hear my typing there for a second. I think that talking to your employees about it, honestly, is the most important thing. And if you can create a workspace that allows them to not feel like their home is invasive, I think that's a really important thing. Also, like, I don't have a TV. I don't have an Alexa. If people don't want to have certain things connected in their homes or opt into certain technology, I manage my communities on Telegram now instead of Facebook communities. There are ways to do things that are less that mitigate a little bit of the risk that you find with increased communication over the internet versus IRL. And I definitely understand the security there. And I appreciate whoever asked this question, because I think we don't necessarily talk about it a lot. I mean, data privacy isn't the sexiest topic, but on the flip side, it's actually extremely important. And when it comes to employee well-being, that privacy and security in their home is of the utmost importance. I don't want this being recorded, and I don't have any kids. I don't really mind if you take a pic of my dog, but if I did, I would not want that being broadcast. So I think that that's a really important point to bring out. So, all right, we've got, unless anyone's dying to answer that, I don't think that's the case. Ian, did you have anything you wanted to add to the tool question? Or I mean, excuse me, to the digital evolution question, sorry.
Yeah, I was just really inspired by something that Darren mentioned that I wanted to jump off of. So he talked about how much value companies realize there is in unlocking the potential of bringing folks in who can work outside of their HQs. And I think another dimension of this that doesn't get talked enough about is what this does for people who are at various points in their life and caregiving cycles. If you are taking care of children, if you are taking care of parents, companies that are remote friendly, even if not remote first, do present a much more appealing option. And so I think there's a similar unlock happening in realizing that there's an amazing talent pool that due to caregiving responsibilities hasn't been able to be in certain places or in a traditional office, and that there's just an enormous opportunity there to be able to work in a way that we can include those talents.
I love that. Hopefully this creates an environment that is more inclusive, and if our work hours are a little bit different and our environments are supportive of all walks of life, you know, maybe a little gender inequality, maybe a little minority equality starts to happen. It would be a really inspiring thing for us to have. Okay, so we are running low on time. We're gonna close with our lightning round in a moment here. One quick question, and really I think we have only time for one or two people to answer this one. Any poignant reflections or ideas on how to reorganize schedule futures to remain available, collaborative, and productive when some employees are remote, others are hybrid, and others are at HQ? Darren, I'm gonna throw this to you first because you, I know, have a toolkit for this.
Yep, you've got to be remote first. You have to assume that everyone is somewhere else. You have to make sure that there is no epicenter of power or decision making. It should not matter whether you're in an office, whether you're in a spare bedroom, you're at a WeWork, you're in an airplane seat. It has to work in all of those places. So be remote first, and then if people choose to work in an office, that's simply because that's where they're most productive and that's where they choose to work.
Any contrary opinions there? If not, we'll carry forward. All right, I like it.
I'll give a quick contrary. I think that's unrealistic for a lot of organizations to get there that quickly. So again, I would say pace it out. You know, you can't dive in. I think that can create a whole bunch of risks as well. So I think that listening and having feedback loops with your team members, and maybe use prototypes of like groups or people teams who are really aggressively into it, and then roll out. So I maybe go a little slower than that, but the remote first concept is definitely one that is very effective, but it's somewhat advanced as well.
Just to add 2 cents there, Sara, I agree. I think that, earlier we were talking about the remote journey, and most companies need to recognize where they are in that journey. We recommend for those that are taking the first step in their remote journey that they focus on building teams that are in the same time zone as the existing team. Just because if you dive into the deep end, you start to get friction points that will kind of negate the benefits you're getting of going remote. You really need to think about how you sequence your journey to make sure that you're maximizing the benefits of remote while taking the time to build the infrastructure, build the practice, and become that remote first kind of mindset that Darren mentioned.
Fantastic insights. I'm personally very curious to see what pans out, and could see a lot of different things. I do think we're going to see a very dramatic shift, whether it's every human may or may not be the case. All right, friends, all we have left now is our lightning round. I feel like there's no soft shoulder in 2020. Things are either cruising along just fine, or you are absolutely in the ditch on the side of the road. It's tough. You've just unleashed a lot of knowledge, and as I mentioned, we will do a resource thread with all of the links that we talked about here, both on Twitter. I'm at @SavasSavvy. I'll tag everyone here. We can also put them on LinkedIn if you'd like. Savannah Peterson will build a nice little thread of resources from this wonderful chat. But for this lightning round, all right, folks, your one core piece of advice for keeping sane in this crazy time. And do let folks how to find you and find out more about your work, your products, or your general brilliance. Let's go in reverse order from the start. We'll go Darren first this time, since you were last out the gate.
Awesome. Thanks all for joining today. So here's what you can do to stay sane. If you're used to having a commute, block that time in your calendar to ramp in and out of your day. Swap the commute for reading or meditating or calling your parents or walking the dog, something that is therapeutic to you. Maybe it's resting more. In terms of finding me, I'm Darren Murph on Twitter, and I would encourage you to Google Coursera and GitLab. We just launched an incredible 11-hour course on how to manage and lead a remote team. It is free to complete. I know Coursera is a part of this event. Happy to be partnering with them. So check that out. Give us feedback. We want to make it better.
I will go next if it's cool, so save some time. I'm pretty sure everybody in the panel will give like really good tips on remote work specifically. I want to give a tip for something else. It's a huge pandemic. A lot of companies have like problems with revenue, customers, and so on and so on. There is a website called workonmainstreet.com where you can plug in your payroll and your other tools, and they will get you state grants, tax refunds, tax credits, literally any money that you can get for free, they will try to get for you. And they only charge you if they actually are able to get a certain threshold of enough money back to you. So workonmainstreet.com.
Cool. And I'm Sara Sutton again at FlexJobs, and we also have remote.co, which is a resource. We've interviewed over 140 remote